When we speak about the Islamic State of Khorasan, I think that the counterterrorism operations against the group in Afghanistan have been hyperbolized by making the Taliban look like a savior on an alliance in Afghanistan. I do not think that those counterterrorism operations were as successful as they have been proclaimed to be. The group always existed, and it was by strategy that it actually went underground, and it will keep on existing till we actually uncover the operations of the group, on how it actually works and how its facilitation networks exist across the world.
As news of the Moscow concert hall attack broke on Friday, accusations began almost immediately. President Vladimir Putin openly claimed that the man who attacked Moscow had tried to flee to Ukraine, helped by contacts there. When Mr. Putin made his comments on Saturday in an address to the Russian nation, Islamic State group extremists had already announced they had carried out the killing. The United States had confirmed that it passed on intelligence of a threat earlier this month, but Putin snubbed that warning about possible attacks in Moscow and described it as blackmail. Politician Alexander Kinstein revealed that Russian police had stopped a car with suspected attackers in the western Bryansk region on Saturday. Two suspects were apprehended after a shootout while others fled to the forest. He said the car contained Tajik passports, a pistol, and ammunition.
Tajikistan has a tumultuous history. If you look into the history of IS within Tajikistan itself, one of the biggest proponents of ISKP's agenda, which gave a major boost to the group in 2015, was its head of special operations of its police force, who was a lieutenant colonel in Tajikistan that deflected and joined ISKP. And he was one of the persons that actually drove a massive recruitment drive. And if statistics on that time are to be believed, even it's in initial form, he managed to recruit somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 Tajiks, and amongst whom he actually took a large number away to Syria. It was always believed that he was killed in a strike, but somehow the Tajik government has not been able to, verify the reports and claims that he was killed. So he was the mastermind behind this entire network in Tajikistan, who appeared in several videos from Syria at that time, because he was leading a specific core within the Islamic State central domain that actually related to ISKP, as well as it had recruits from the European countries as well. Why Tajikistan? So when we look at the trajectory in terms of Tajikistan, Central Asian republics, in its essence, have usually totalitarian regimes. And it's difficult for them to actually go back home in one way or another if they are recruited into a certain group militant faction. And that is why the only way that they actually can survive is finding a certain place where they can continue with the ideology that they have. And so we have seen in the recent past, as well as historically, Central Asian jihadists from Tajikistan as well as Uzbekistan finding some sort of recruitment base, as well as a place where they can actually functional ideologically in Pakistan as well as Afghanistan. But when you talk about Russia, obviously it has its own diplomatic relationship with Tajikistan, as well as there are a large number of Tajikis that are living and Uzbeks living in Russia as well. Um, how this entire operation was pulled off is a surprise for several countries as well, including Russia itself. For such a massive attack, it almost seems like a 9/11 for the Russian state itself, who's still trying to grapple the aftermath of it and to come up with results for its own public as well, to show that they have managed to get hold of these culprits. But to say that this will be the last attack by ISKP, I think that's not correct. And to say that ISKP only relies on recruits of ISKP fighters is also technically incorrect, because we've seen evidences that the Islamic State has been using fundamentally loosely related criminal elements, as well as people that are linked to narco trade and drug mafias as well, to a certain means to an end by using them to carry out attacks. It is yet to see on what the specific cell that carried out an attack in Russia actually means.
Now, the ISKP is waging a war on the Taliban movement that seized power in Afghanistan after the withdrawal of US forces in 2021.
So, in order to understand what ISKP is, I think it needs a little bit of a background understanding even before August 15, 2021, before the US and allied NATO forces they moved out of Afghanistan. It's not like the Islamic State had stopped its activities even before that. It's very evident and clear that IS was operating in four different succinct periods of time in which the group's dynamics in terms of its operational capabilities as well as its strategic capabilities that include its financing as well as logistic cells, how they were operating. From 2014 and 2000 till 2016, we see IS basically a conglomerate, four different groups, which is the first part of it is basically the ones that actually oppose the Afghan Taliban state. The second part of it is those groups of the TTP because of its leadership crisis as well as looking for more financial and logistic. Was a group that was actually on the rise in the Middle East and it had a huge financial basis. Rather, it was holding almost a country and a half and joined it. And then there were, specifically certain Salafist circles within the Pakistan and Afghanistan domain, foreign elements in terms of foreign fighters that include not just Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and the larger Central Asia on what ISKP usually refers to as the Khorasan region. It also included dissident elements from the Uyghur provinces of Xinjiang, and also people from different parts of India, particularly Maharashtra, as well as Tamil Nadu. And it also had attracted a large number of people from the Middle East. So, by 2016, the Americans they had understood that this is a growing threat, and they started off an operation in areas which ISKP had declared as its caliphate. And they began an operation which severely dented the group's top leadership at that time. And then the secondary group that emerged, the leadership that emerged from ISKP, was basically the group that was partially a mixture of younger recruits as well as some of the remnants of the old form of the jihadist elements that had joined them. But these operations continued on the Pak-Afghan border from the Pakistani side, as well as from the Americans as well as the Afghan National Army. And so the sizes started shrinking, and then we saw almost hundreds of them laying down arms and being put in jail. When you refer to Pule Charkhi and Bagram in terms of numbers, ISKP never stopped its publications, neither did it ever stop attacks. The threshold of it had gone lower, but that does not mean that the group had succinctly, ended its operations. Rather, between 2018 till 2020, the group has one of the most, fertile periods in terms of its publication of propaganda and consolidating more newer recruits that were unknown to the world. And then in 2020, we see a total different ISKP re-emerging in which the older jihadist elements are in the backdrop, but they are people who are actually engineers and doctors as well as university students joining the group. And we see a new leadership emerge in the form of, the person that's come to be known as Shahabul Mahajar, the leader of the ISIS Khorasan chapter. And then in 2021 is the fourth phase of ISKP, where the jail breaks. And according to official records, there were more than 1,900 of ISKP men that actually came out of jail that were in custody, that regrouped. But I won't say that all of them regrouped. Some of them were actually in a position where they could not regroup, and so they had to, lay down arms, and they were living normal lives like anyone else. But what we do see is an escalation in terms of the Central Asian part that became to be, one of the most lethal parts, which is basically from Tajikistan. Now, the part of Tajikistan that is part of ISKP is basically known as Mawarun Nahar in Tajiki. Mawarun Nahar basically refers to the part where it means the other side of the river. And so they use the prophetic, references in terms of that the army that would take over the Khorasan region and march towards, the religious sites of Islam to take over the land will actually emerge from the other side of the river. And if you look at it in terms of statistical and from a statistical perspective, and also the larger counterterrorism perspective, we now see that the Tajiki cell of the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is known as Mubarak Nahar, has been one of the most deadly, not just in Afghanistan but in Pakistan, and now we also see Moscow coming under attack. I don't see that in terms of Afghanistan's financial crisis, the Taliban's ideology would be somewhat, infiltrated by IS. But definitely not because of its economic part, because even under the current circumstances, while the Afghan state itself is economically, losing its leverage and strength, the Taliban as an entity is becoming stronger. These are the trends that we have been observing. But simultaneously, to say that people have actually left the Taliban and joined ISKP, under the current circumstances, I don't think that holds true till quite an extent. Whatever deflection there was in the group, that has taken place previously. But the problem with the Taliban's governance system is that it has an element like ISKP. So the more its governance becomes palatable to the Western societies in forms of democracy, as well as the kind of governance that a Western humanistic perspective would require, if the Taliban actually adhere to that, they become, a sort of a criticism point for ISKP. And then, when we look at it from the perspective of counterterrorism theory as well, there will always be groups and subgroups which seem to be more attractive in terms of radical elements. So the Taliban will always remain a radical element in the society. So if they try to change their ideology, it becomes a double-edged sword for them, that they would actually be, leaving out space for ISKP, which hasn't happened so far on a drastic way. But there are elements within the Taliban that obviously have the capacity as well as the discontent under the current form of governance. If the Taliban loses its leverage over them by becoming more and more Western friendly, they will join us.
Even though Moscow still lists the Taliban as a terrorist group, it has intensified contact with it, welcoming its emissaries in Moscow and to regional security conferences.
In terms of Russia and China, obviously after the United States left, uh, from previous experiences, these states always thought of Afghanistan as a space that could be manipulated by jihadist elements. And so they did not want to repeat on what happened in the early 90s that ultimately ended up in 9/11. And even the United States, after leaving, had welcomed that Afghanistan is now a regional problem. So it is for the regional powers to sit together and solve their problems. Their interest in Afghanistan is obviously related to the large trade corridors that everybody keeps on speaking about, but hasn't tapped in completely. It also, aims in bringing up the larger South Asian markets to the more Eastern European and Central European markets through Afghanistan as a connecting route. And also, mines and minerals has been on the agenda for a very long time. Whether these projects actually, become something that are feasible in the near future is something that we have to see. But in terms of the violence that it has attracted from various jihadist elements, if a literary preview from Al Qaeda to ISKP, all groups have their certain kind of agendas against both countries. So Russia by ISKP is actually seen as a country that sided with Bashar al-Assad along with Iran and brought down their caliphate in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq in particular. So for them, it is more of a revenge tactic to target Russia. And the ISKP and IS has produced tons of propaganda material against Russia. Rather, we saw even two attacks on the Russian embassy in Afghanistan in the aftermath of August 15 and 2021, as well as the ISKP also believes that the Russians have been attacking the Sunni population in Syria and Iraq, and so they want to avenge that as well. And this is very prominent in ISKP's literature. As far as China is concerned, one of the groups that actually merged into ISKP was the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which is basically Uyghur Muslim jihadist organization banned and wanted in China. And so ISKP basically sees Chinese interests in Afghanistan as one of the major source of targets because China is expanding its anti-Islamic agenda according to the group itself. And so we've seen at least two major attacks against Chinese installations and Chinese nationals in Afghanistan as well. So both of these countries, along with Pakistan, actually focus prominently in this entire propaganda framework uh, for being targeted by the Islamic State. But then it has a certain kind of a level on who is their first target. So in the Islamic State, agenda, Iran is at the top, and then there's the Afghan Taliban, and then there's Russia, and then there is China, and obviously Pakistan features above all of it. It's a kind of structure that they have created on who to target at what time. There's one thing that is very evident and clear in Islamic State's literature, particularly ISKP. It's working on a certain agenda where it does not actually look at, getting space or capitalizing on space as a recruitment base. It's using the cyber domain to recruit and carry out operations on an individual cell level, which they actually refer to as katibas. One of the basic agendas of ISKP is to actually stir wars between nation states. How they do that is that they, in terms of their operational perspective, would always deploy cross nationals to be used against each other. So, if you look at the early attacks that were carried out on Pakistani consulates in Jalalabad, they used Indian target, Pakistani consulates in Jalalabad. Simultaneously, they would have used Pakistani bombers maybe in Afghanistan, exist, but this is just by hypothesis. And they've used Tajiki bombing cells in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and in Russia as well. Look at the larger perspective on what it's trying to do, because ISKP by default does not believe in nation states. And in their ideology, that nation states go to clash against each other so that democratic elements as well as the peaceful facade that the world has put up, it is useful because they'll be able to actually garner more support, as well as they think that chaos between nation states would give them a fertile recruitment ground from which they can get new opportunities.